Okay, I know folks are still coming in, but we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. Before we officially get started, a few housekeeping notes. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll be dropping in the chat to purchase The Hard Sell, Crime and Punishment and an Opioid Startup. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A. Q&A can be found along the bottom of your screen. Q&A is different from chat. Chat will also be open and we welcome your comments. We'll try to get to everybody's questions, but I apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We are delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, simply click on the live transcripts option, which is also along the bottom of your screen. Now it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speakers. Evan Hughes was a finalist for the National Magazine Award in Reporting in 2015. He has written for the New York Times Magazine, GQ, New York, Wired, and the New York Review of Books. He is also the author of Literary Brooklyn. Hughes will be in conversation with Alexis Coe. Coe is the author of You Never Forget Your First and Alice plus Frida Forever, A Murder in Memphis. Coe has contributed to The New Yorker, The New York Times, Opinion Section and Magazine, The New Republic, The Paris Review, and many others. She regularly appears on MSNBC, CNN, and the History Channel, where she was a consulting producer on Doris Kearns Goodwin's Washington series. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn the screen over to the evening speakers. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea.
Welcome everyone at home for joining us on the very first day that The Hard Sell is out in the world. It came out today, as you may know, because you saw Evan on TV or you heard him on the radio or you read one of the glowing reviews the book has received. Before we get into the conversation, Evan, can you give the folks at home who haven't read the book yet a summary, an overview?
Yeah, sure. So this is a dramatic rise and fall story, a story about a corporate scandal. And it's a corporate scandal at a startup. They were an opioid manufacturer. They marketed a highly potent drug based on fentanyl. But they were this scrappy startup. They're started by this visionary founder. He saw his wife suffering from cancer, going through terrible pain, wants to develop a pain drug that will help with that. The product works, and the company became the top performing IPO of 2013. Big success, celebrated by Wall Street, celebrated in the business press, until it emerged slowly, and then quicker and quicker, just how Insys was, the company's called Insys Therapeutics, just how Insys was achieving its success. And the company collapsed in scandal, and it all led to this major criminal trial in Boston that I attended and I covered for the book. And the top executives ended up testifying against one another. And it was a landmark case.
Let's talk about why you wrote the book, which started out as a feature for the New York Times Magazine. But it wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't the end of the story for you. So at what point did you think, oh, I have to see this all the way through. I have to, give this greater context. And how is the research process different writing a book than writing a magazine story?
So I think all along it really built, and I really became obsessed with this story and with the people who figured in it. I mean, they're real characters in this book who are kind of unforgettable to me. I mean, it just that they were in real life and are in real life, and I'm still in touch with many of them. And they, while I was reporting the story for the Times Magazine, I first got the assignment from the Times like way back now, 5 years. And while I was reporting it, some of the top executives at the company had been arrested, but not all of them. And, there was kind of this parlor game among people who were watching the story of like, how high in the pyramid is this going to go in the hierarchy? Are they ever going to take down the top guy? And then like right in the middle of while I'm working on the article, they take down the top guy. So that was a big day, very exciting. And then like, at the time that I published the article, however, this was like many months in the making, they had not gone to trial. And I just by that point was so fixated and wanted to be there for the trial and wanted to keep writing about the story in a larger way. And I think often when you report a long magazine story, you toy with this, like, could this be a book? But this was the first one I was absolutely certain that it could be a book, that it should be a book. And so, I had to see what happened. That was like the main reason I wanted to write the book.
That's the best reason. And it's sort of inescapable in that way every time. That's when you know it's right. You have to do it. So I want to tell the audience at home, if you have a question now or later, you don't want to forget it, go ahead and put it in the chat, in the Q&A, and I will either, insert it into the conversation or we will get to it at the end. So let's jump into the book itself. I'm going to ask you to read just a little bit. When Alec Burlakoff, who's a main character and a source of yours, comes onto the scene. So can you set that up for us and then read us a short bit?
Sure. So actually, I'm gonna do some visuals here, and you will all see that I am a writer and I'm not a graphic designer, because this is my little homemade attempt at an org chart. Just bear with me for a second. So this is a sort of makeshift org chart of the top characters in the company. At the top here, we have John Kapoor, the visionary scientist. Then his young protege, Mike Babbage, who he hires when he's a young guy, basically just out of college. And they together like start this company, bare bones operation. They're developing this drug. It takes forever to develop a drug and get it approved by the FDA. They finally launch it. It's a big moment. Kapoor has sunk all this money into the product. It needs to sell. And when it comes right out of the gate, when it launches, so to speak, to the market, it's a failure, basically. It doesn't sell. And Kapoor is furious. And he's looking for a way to turn things around. And that's when Alec Burlakoff here enters the picture. He's a salesman. He's applying to be a manager, but really he has designs on like being the top guy, the head of sales. And eventually he is. And that's what this represents, is the whole sales force is underneath him. Now, not everyone knows how pharma sales works, but basically like these drug companies, they blanket the country with sales reps who, face to face call on doctors' offices and try to convince them to prescribe the medication. And they put incredible mileage on their cars. They have like, a territory might be like a whole state, and they drive around going to doctors' offices. Lots of doctors don't want to deal with them at all. So you have to be sort of pushy and get in there. And Burlakoff had a career as a sales rep, and this is the kind of guy he was. And so he poses himself. He's eager for the job and poses himself as kind of the turnaround artist that Insys needs. So I'll just read a little bit here. Portrait of him. It was right at this time of tumult at Insys, with Kapoor maximally dissatisfied and furious, that Alec Burlakoff entered the picture, asking about a job. He was 38 years old and applying to be a manager, but when he traveled from his Florida home to meet Babbage and Kapoor in Arizona, that's where the company was based, he made no secret of the fact that he had much bigger designs. He captured Kapoor's attention right away. Kapoor had a serious problem as he saw it. In Burlakoff, he saw the glimmer of a solution. Burlakoff's arrival would prove to be the most consequential turning point in the entire Insys saga. To meet Alec Burlakoff was to know he was a salesman through and through. For him, it was the family business. His father made a living selling Honda Accords, and his brother sold cars too. Berlikov stood just 5 feet 9 inches, but he projected a swagger and a charisma that made people turn their heads in his direction, and he relished that attention. His smile always looked a little like a smirk, as if he knew something that everyone else was missing. As a sales rep earlier in his career, Berlikov had a knack for ingratiating himself with a doctor enough to get past the front desk, or better yet, get the target out of the office for a more personal conversation. The money hours, he called it, were the ones outside the 9 to 5 workday. Meet with a doctor then, and you could find some, quote, hot button, some desire or need that you could fulfill. He developed a close rapport with one doctor in particular and made tens of thousands in bonuses off his prescriptions. Quote, since the day I started working in pharma sales, I could do nothing wrong, he once said with typical brazenness. Berlikov punched above his weight when it came to attracting women. They would roll their eyes at him and then order another drink, getting a little contact high from his confidence and outsized presence. On an early date on a dinner cruise with the woman who became his wife, he ducked out for a minute, saying he needed to go to the bathroom, and played a hand of blackjack. Berlikov could do outrageous things and be easily forgiven. Still, his oily aggressiveness didn't go unnoticed at Eli Lilly. That's where he started his career. Word spread that he had sold cars with his dad for a brief spell during college. His fellow reps started giving him a hard time about being literally a used car salesman. He didn't like the snobbish insinuation. He often credited his father with teaching him everything he knew about how to sell. Berlikov was drawn to people who made their way without having the education or pedigree that big pharma favored. He thought the idea that you need a college degree to be a sales rep was, quote, bullshit.
So Berlikov comes on the scene. It's not day one. Kapoor and Babbage have been working on this. It's been approved. It's just not doing what they want it to do.
Yeah.
How does he change things?
So what's important to know is the drug was approved. It's so powerful. It's 50 to 100 times as powerful as morphine. It's more powerful than OxyContin, than heroin. It was approved for a very narrow slice of people, which was like cancer patients in very dire straits, people near the end of life usually. It wasn't that big a market. So that's not how they marketed the drug. And the scheme was to convince doctors to prescribe it for all kinds of pain. And that meant going to doctors and targeting doctors who were dubious, who were prolifically prescribing opioids and who were careless. And so the scheme they come up with is essentially to bribe these doctors to prescribe the product. And then they end up having to con the insurers into paying for it, because the insurers would never be paying for it if they knew the truth. And the bribery comes in the form of, essentially, they sign up these doctors to do talks about the benefit of the product. This is supposed to be like private room at a restaurant. They talk to other doctors about, how great Subsys is. That was what the drug was called. But, what Berlikov would say is like, well, the presentations, they don't really matter. It doesn't really matter what the doctor says about the drug. It's all a pretext. The idea is of this speaker program, so-called, is you pay the doctor to speak. Doesn't really matter if he speaks. You're paying to get money in the hands of the doctor so that in return, he's going to prescribe the product. And this becomes like really a nationwide scheme.
So it starts to work. The doctors are taking the money, they're prescribing the drugs. When does it, how big does it get? What numbers are we talking about here? How pervasive is it?
Yeah, so this is a small company, and it was a small niche, as I said, that the drug was designed for. So this is not a drug that ever and this is one reason that insists not everybody's heard of it. It was a drug that that it didn't flood the streets the way that like OxyContin did. Um, it, but it was extremely dangerous and exacted a toll. And it also, like, the entire story of Insys illustrates a bigger story about how these drugs have been marketed and sold, not only by this one company, but by all of their competitors. And, part of my technique in the book is that the book isn't like a speech or a tirade about like how bad this all was, which is sort of obvious. Yes, it was very bad. Um, it's a narrative that kind of takes you, what I was trying to do is like get in the mind of these executives and look at how they saw the world. I could have told the story of like how outside investigators saw the world, the prosecutors, and they do enter into the book. But really the heart of the book is like inside the mind of, like, you could call them the bad guys, and, how they rationalized the decisions they made, the system in which they operated, the incentives they were responding to. And, you see that like everybody else that they were in competition was playing the same game, and that this is a systemic issue.
You write that nothing that they did was truly new. And then today in the Times, the reviewer wrote, "Until I read The Hard Sell about the outrageous behavior of an obscure drug company, I hadn't appreciated the full extent of the filth or the dark stain the opioid sector has left on the entire industry." We know from the news that there are serious industry-wide issues. We knew that before, but these big pharma cases aren't all the same. So how does this differ from someone we know well and has been in the news recently, Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos?
Oh, good question. Well, two things. One, I would say that doesn't apply to Theranos, but I think is important, is that it differs from a lot of the cases we hear about, because the model we all know and are used to in the drug world, the drug business, pharma business, is that like drug companies routinely come under investigation for tactics like this: marketing tactics, kickbacks to doctors, off-label prescribing, it's called, and off-label promotion. But what always happens is, years down the road, it all ends in a settlement. There's a dollar figure, and the company pays the money. That has the effect of essentially suppressing all of the evidence of exactly what went on at the company, which the company is happy to do. and it means the executives walk away. So what made this case really different is the Department of Justice decided to send a message. They actually arrested the top people involved and criminally charged them as individuals. So it wasn't against the company. After all, as someone at DOJ said, corporations don't commit crimes, people do. People make these decisions. So they went after the people, and that's what made it kind of groundbreaking. And that meant that there was going to be a trial, because these people's lives were at stake, their freedom. And the trial there's nothing like the public reckoning of a trial to kind of like break open how the companies are doing business. And that was really unprecedented. Second thing, on the Elizabeth Holmes point, one thing is, like, Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, they had a product that was fake. It never worked. And they weren't even a profitable company. They had very little revenue. Insys, the product worked. And actually, I think, some people would say like a product like this should never be in the hands of anyone. I'm not sure I agree. I think it actually was quite a valuable drug and could have been of great value to people, terminally ill. But and not only the product worked, but the company had a great deal of success. They had something like 500 million in sales on this product in 2015. They had a market cap over $3 billion. So there was more to unravel there.
So in a situation like this, they, one of the many astounding quotes they didn't think they would go to jail. They didn't think that they would be charged with anything, that they would end up in prison, that they would be arrested even. They thought that there would be a financial penalty and they would move on with their lives.
Yeah.
There can't really be justice, but is there accountability when these people, when they do go to prison or they're in some cases confined to their home? Does that change anything? Does it send a message?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Justice Department, deserves some credit for what they did in this case. That the fact was that the conduct was so outrageous. They recruited strippers to woo doctors. They made this like self-celebratory rap video about that was played for the jury at the trial, which was quite a moment. And they also left behind like a wealth of evidence. They put everything in an email. It was like as reckless as you can be. And so like this gave the Department of Justice a lot to work with. Now, bigger companies, they don't put it in an email. They're smarter than that. They have better lawyers. They have better compliance professionals. And so, Insys gets caught, and an analogy I draw in the book is like, the speed limit's 55 miles an hour. And like, in this case, the speed limit is designed, to protect the patient. Insys gets caught for going 85 miles an hour in the speed in a 55, but that doesn't stop the rest of the industry for going 75, which is what they routinely do. And I don't think it will stop them going forward.
I don't claim to know anything about business. I'm a political historian, but if I were to start a company of any means, I would hire in-house counsel. That just seems like very basic to me, particularly if I was going to do illegal things, but just as a general operating, standard. How did they not do that? How did they not know that? How did people not tell them that? And would that have precluded any of this?
It really is kind of astounding. Early on in the company, John Kapoor, who started the company, like before it went public, he was the only investor. So this is like all his money, every salary, he's writing the check. And he just insisted, like, I don't want to pay a lawyer. I don't want, do you want to pay the lawyer? Like people were pressing him and saying like, we really should have in-house counsel. We really should have like a head of compliance. And he was just like, we don't need that. We're a bare bones operation. This is how it's going to be. Now, and it goes all the way up until like they get a subpoena from the federal government, which is like your sign that you're under investigation. And that happened in late 2013, and they still don't have a lawyer at that point. So right quick, they hire a big time law firm, Skadden and Arps. But like by then, a lot of the damage is done. And, I feel like this is one of the lessons of the story is that, like, as I said, like a bigger company, with more experienced people, they take more self-protective measures. They do more to disguise the true intentions. So part of this story, and I don't want to say that every drug company is breaking the law. That wouldn't be fair, but they are all trying to like push the bounds of it. And when like regulations kind of cut in on one tactic they have, they find another. It's a game, because if you're not playing that game, you can't compete. And so what differentiated Insys may have been more their sort of recklessness than actually the conduct.
So we've talked about the range of evidence and the government's role, but can you talk a little bit more about how this all came crashing down?
Yeah. So I just mentioned that they get a subpoena in 2013. That was the result of like a secret lawsuit filed by a whistleblower at the company. she was one of my sources in the book. And it was kind of exciting for me because she hadn't spoken to any other media. Um, and she came forward. She actually wasn't the first whistleblower to come forward. There was another who was not successful. But this is a big phenomenon in the drug industry, is that whistleblower lawsuits are like a major enforcement tool. This is how a lot of this information comes to light, how these scandals get prosecuted. So that someone will come forward, and actually in the law, there's like an incentive that the whistleblower stands to share in any money that is recovered by the government. And so, and it's a way that, then eventually the government like claws back the money. So that's one piece of it. There were whistleblowers. The other piece is like the doctors that the company was getting in bed with. They were targeting these pretty dubious people. They started getting in trouble. The clinic gets shut down, under DEA scrutiny. Then another doctor got arrested, and he was one of their top prescribers. And like the fact that he was one of their top prescribers is public. So it's like a PR mess for Insys to deal with. And a lot of this starts to like shake loose the relationships that they had built with these doctors. And it ended up that like a couple of them ended up testifying at the trial against the executives.
So these are real people. Everyone I write about is good and dead. So they do not, their ancestors, their heirs, and sometimes they're not, which is my favorite situation. But you talk to these people, you have relationships, you're still in contact with them. What is that like, in particular, to go through such a life-changing process?
It is intense, like when people talk to you about, probably the darkest chapter of their life. I talked to patients who suffered terribly in this. And then it's a dark chapter in the lives of the people who were involved in the scandal as well. They may have gone to jail. They may have, been fired at the company. They're under a cloud. And you're sort of trying to earn their trust and have them like tell their story. And like, you have to, I have a lot of like, it is only because people talk to you that you're able to write a book. This couldn't be the book that it is with me just going to the trial. I like, well before that, I was like working my way up the org chart of the company that we saw before, like talking to ex-employees, some of them anonymously, and then like ultimately was fortunate that some of the higher ranking people at the company talked to me, and particularly Alec Berlikoff himself, who we just heard about. He ended up flipping on Dr. Kapoor and becoming a cooperating witness for the government. And then following that, decided to talk to me at length and on the record. And I think that opened up a lot for me. And, it's always difficult. It never gets easy. You're aware that you have a lot of responsibility to portray people as accurately as you can and as fairly. Never gets easy.
There were so many colorful moments in the book and with people. And I find that as a reader, moments stay with you and you remember scenes and sort of feelings. But as an author, it's interesting because there are so many moments that don't make it into the book. Or it's just not really noticeable to readers, but it's really important to you. Are there moments like that for you with this book? Something that happened during the trial or during the early stages or in the aftermath that just sort of, sticks to you?
Mm-hmm. I mean, you talk about, I don't know that this is like particularly close to my heart because there is a reason that I decided to exclude, but but it was a really it was a scandal that really was far reaching. It was across the country. So like all of these doctors also got prosecuted separately in different trials everywhere. And then like sometimes the INSYS sales reps who called on those doctors got prosecuted. So like this Boston trial with these top executives was kind of like the main event, but then there's all these other, it's just like a huge galaxy of litigation. Um, and like, I had to be selective. Like each of those like pain clinics and the doctor and the rep is like kind of a great story, but it's like there's only so many you can put in the book. And I wanted it to be, it's a kind of a tightly focused and pretty like fast moving book. I tried to sort of do that. And so like, I attended this trial in SDNY in Manhattan where like 5 doctors got indicted together in connection with all of this, with basically taking bribes from INSYS. And I attended the trial, developed relationships with the lawyer. None of it's in the book. Like I just decided like those guys didn't make the cut. And so you're sort of like, wow, there, all of November of 2015 is gone, like or whatever, like all the time you spent. But you got to be sort of ruthless sometimes.
It's true. But there are all these great stories and stories that you can sort of imagine happening as well. And it feels like a drama. And you can imagine, I like the chapter titles. I always felt like they were really exciting and like propelling you forward. And you can sort of imagine them flashing in front of a movie theater. And indeed, the book has been optioned before it was published, which is pretty rare. It's still early days, but can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I can't say too much about it, but I could say that there is, yes, the book was optioned, and there is like a film inspired by the book that's in development at Sony Pictures. I mean, one thing that's exciting for me is that like through no work of my own, like the screenwriter attached to this, as well as Tower, who's like a writer I really respect, who kind of comes from my world. He writes journalism, he writes fiction, and he's kind of like made a transition to doing some Hollywood work. But it's a more comfortable feeling because like I'm a foreigner to the whole like movie world, and so I really don't have like any close involvement with the film. I just sort of like get the news along with everybody else. But there does seem to be momentum behind it, and that's pretty exciting.
You don't really play into this book, you don't insert yourself into the narrative. So what are the chances it'll like open with Evan Hughes rolling out of bed like after a hard night?
I hope that the chances of that are zero. No, I mean, that was like a very conscious choice in the book that like I'm not in it. There's no uses of the word I think. And there were some really interesting like interviews I conducted that I could have sort of made a scene out of, I think, but I wanted to stay out of it and let the story do the work, and the characters be the characters who really lived it. And there was one part, the trial. One of the things that was dramatic about it is that like it's a 10-week trial, and then the parties rested, went to the jury deliberations, sometimes a day, 2, 3 days, 4 maybe. Well, this was a month. The jury was out for 4 weeks deliberating, and like no one involved with the trial had ever seen a jury go out that long. And it was like painful for me, and of course more so for the parties involved and the defendants. But when it finally happened, like I was like standing in the hallway outside the courtroom, and like one of the lawyers came out and was like, verdict. She just said it to me, and I remember my heart beating so fast. And I went back into the courtroom. There was only a few people there, and then like everybody just descended, like the whole U.S. Attorney's office, all these journalists and everything, within 15 minutes um, for the big show. But in the book, like I mentioned that like a lawyer spoke one word to a reporter and said verdict, and the reporter's me, but I refer to myself as a reporter.
But you're in there. You're in there.
That's my cameo.
That's you. So I'm going to turn to the questions now. You can keep asking questions. I think there's a link to buy the book in the chat. So this Mike Liver mentions Hulu's limited series Dope Sick, which I watched actually after I read The Hard Sell because I just needed like another fix. Do you want to give your opinion as to whether the book and TV series were also reasonably similar and accurate?
So I have to confess that I have barely watched any of Dope Sick. Maybe I was like too wrapped up in my own opioid story. I am familiar with the book and have a lot of respect for it. It's largely about the Purdue Pharma and OxyContin story, which is like a more famous and well-known story. This one is quite different, quite a bit smaller, and in that way, like to me, that became like a strength of the story, is that like I could kind of get my arms around it. There was only like so many people who actually like made the key decisions at this company. It's like normally at a company like Purdue Pharma or Eli Lilly or something, you'd have a million layers of bureaucracy, and like the CEO would never get involved in like meeting with individual shady doctors, which is something that happened at Insys. So I think part of what like makes the story a little cinematic is it's this miniaturized world where like everybody from the executive suite to the doctors out in the field, they're all kind of like touching each other.
That's true. In Dope Sick, the Sacklers are like having their evil rich dinners, and then everyone else at the company is at the company. It is intimate, and well, we'll get to that. Can you speak to the role of the whistleblowers in this story? Full disclosure, I represented Mia.
Oh, well, I'm glad to see you there. They played an incredibly valuable role. Mia is Mia Guzman, and she was the prime mover, the first whistleblower who sparked the investigation that eventually culminated in all of this. And as I said, this is comment. It's really like the legal system in many ways relies on this, because you're not going to get inside a company as an investigator. They're all unlike Insys, they're generally like lawyered up. They're going to turn over the least possible information they can if the government comes calling. So it really relies on people on the inside, and it's like a very lonely position to be in if you're one of these whistleblowers. It all has to be in secret. You're totally barred from discussing the case for years. And Mia actually, like, I was well into the process of reporting the book when it emerged who the whistleblower was, and it was Mia. And this was like an incredible shock to me because I already knew a good friend of hers who was a coworker, who was a source, and Tracy is her name, Tracy Crane. She's in the book, a fellow sales rep, and Tracy would always talk to me about Mia, and she's like, "Oh, you should call Mia. She would be great on this." And whenever I called Mia, she ignored me. And then finally I come to realize it's because she had a pending lawsuit against the company. And then eventually, after that emerged and became public, she was able to speak. And I have a lot of gratitude for her for doing so.
And what was that process like for her, for Mia? What was,
Yeah, I mean, for any whistleblower, like I said, it's so lonely because you're you know you're involved in the company, and at the same time, like, she was collecting evidence against them, and she was recording phone calls, she was recording meetings surreptitiously on her iPhone. She would have it like beneath the table, and she had to be terrified of getting caught. And she was actually alarmed, not just at the at the at the the bribery scheme and the marketing tactics, but like the atmosphere of like sexual exploitation at the company. All the top people at the company were men. Many of the sales reps were women. There were a lot of affairs within the company and some pretty nasty behavior. Um, and and she was able to put together a lot of evidence and come forward. Um, and and by that time she had been terminated from the company, so that at least gave her some freedom to no longer be inside the the belly of the beast, so to speak. But it's a tough position to be in, and you know it also has like no guarantees of paying off.
How did Derek Douglas wants to know, how did the FDA and other government entities, gatekeepers, fail to regulate bad actors like incest?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. I mean, the it's a natural question. How did it get this far? Don't we have agencies that are supposed to be like guarding the gates here so that it doesn't become a criminal case? And it is kind of, I mean, a little bit enraging when you look into it deeply that the FDA, they see it as their job is to approve products and judge whether they're safe and effective for the uses for which they're designed, and then the drug goes on the market. After that, they do very little, and they say, like, we don't regulate the practice of medicine. So like the only people watching doctors are state medical boards, but that's kind of like a patchwork system, and they're very slow to act. They don't, they're reluctant to like remove the livelihood of a doctor without a lot of evidence. So it can take years to like get a bad apple out of the system. And I don't know, whenever these like medical complaints, state medical board complaints, when I looked into them, it would just kind of blow my mind that, like the complaint would be like, patient A came to this doctor in 2006 and, would recount the really outlandish malpractice of the doctor. But beginning in 2006, and it was like 2012 when they finally took action on the license of the doctor. So, there are a lot of failings and a lot of links in the chain where this could have been stopped.
A couple people pointed out the news coverage of the case, and that there was a big segment on 60 Minutes, and then PBS also had a show or a segment about it. Do you feel like that accurately portrayed what was happening? Was that around the time of the verdict or the trial rather?
I think all of it came after the trial. And in fact, after the defendants were sentenced, they ended up getting between 1 and 5.5 years in jail, depending on their seniority. And whether they cooperated. Those, what do I say here about those? I mean, TV is such a different animal than writing a book. And that this kind of brought that home to me, like watching this. TV is all about, you put someone on the camera and like they speak and what quotes they give. So really it's like pure quotation. And it also, like, 60 Minutes, for them, it was a pretty in-depth story. I think they did 2 parts. It was like 13 minutes ad and then another 13 minutes. But like really there's very little that you can do in that space. And so like the book is a much more sort of fine-grained and deeper story, and a lot of it can be narrated, and not just done through putting people on camera and having them speak. So it just seemed like I was doing something quite different.
Yeah, and the movie will be quite different than that because it will offer context and background. And that speaks to another question, which was that, and you already spoke to this a little bit, but it is interesting to write the book largely from the perspective of the execs running, i.e. the bad guys, although writing it from the perspective and writing about the experience of the executives are different things.
Yes, true. I mean, I think what I mean by from the perspective is that, like, they are the central characters. They are the people whose kind of mindsets I'm trying to enter. And so, what you see in this is, like, these people, they didn't set out to harm people. They, Kapoor was a very generous philanthropist. He had a building named after him and his late wife at SUNY Buffalo. Gave a lot to cancer causes. Others of them, they coached Little League. They went to church. You wouldn't recognize them on the street as, like, somehow uniquely evil people. They were, and what I mean by getting into their mindset, I think they were operating within a system, and they were responding to what the competition was doing, and they were hungry and they wanted to grab market share like any startup does, and that's what drove them. And, like, the patience became a complete afterthought to that, and it was reckless, and they deserved to be held accountable. But I wanted to see how they saw it, not how I saw it, or cast judgment on them. It's a story. It's a storytelling mode where you can draw your own conclusions.
These are sort of connected. There's a question about the verdict for Kapoor, and I think that speaks to the point that you're making as well. So if we're going to talk about the end of his story here, maybe we should also talk about how it began with this drug, and his wife's story, and how that affected you, whether you let it affect you.
Yeah, I mean, Kapoor was and is a really interesting figure to me. He was an immigrant from India. He came to the US with, like, no money to get a graduate degree. He worked his way up, made some big moves, made millions as an entrepreneur before starting Insys. And Insys, I think he saw it kind of as like a crowning achievement that he was going to start this company. And, like, it was a major event in his life that his wife died of cancer. And she went through terrible suffering. No one disputes this. And he wanted to develop a drug that would address serious pain. And I think that was legitimately a part of his thinking. Did he also have financial motives? Of course. And he saw an opportunity in the market for this kind of drug. But I think he was motivated by that, and kind of a complicated person who really did have some notions of the drug fulfilling a valuable role in society. And then it became like, well, this is the best drug in the class. I have the best product. So anything we can do to beat the other products out is for the best. I think that was really the thinking.
There's a specific question here about the fake call center that they set up in their headquarters. Can you tell us more about that? Why did insurance companies go along and agree to pay for such an expensive and often unnecessary drug?
Yeah, that's good. We haven't really touched on that, but this is kind of the second half of the scheme. The first half is they bribe doctors to prescribe the drug. The second is the drug is really expensive. It's like it was, in the four figures, five figures per month. So like, there were some scripts that were like $25,000 a month at the highest doses. And but like, there are other opioids you could get that are like a fraction of that cost. So, the doctor could prescribe something for, $200 or even $4 for like a generic Vicodin or something. So the drug required prior authorization, they call it. We've all gone through this with the insurance company where they want to say like, well, if we're going to pay for this, like the doctor's prescription isn't good enough. We want to know that like it's really necessary. So um Insys like created a unit within the company that would call the insurance companies and attempt to persuade them to cover the drug. Now, what the people who are supposed to be making those calls are the doctor's office themselves and saying, like, here's why we think the drug is necessary for this patient. But Insys's answer to that was to create this unit and essentially pose as if they were calling from the doctor's office, and then bend and break the truth left and right about like what actually was wrong with these patients, what was needed, and like it became part of the whole sales operation. It was just the idea was getting to yes. And like as to why the insurers were duped, I mean, it's a really good question of like, sometimes they looked into things more deeply and like would deny the claim, but generally, they thought they were talking to the doctor's office. They had some reason to like trust it. And also, if you had like an infrastructure in an insurance company, it was actually, it's not worth going into the technicalities, but it was a pharmacy benefit manager, PBM, which is like a contractor for insurance company. But if they were going to investigate every claim, it would be incredibly expensive and resource intensive. So like sometimes it's cheaper to have people in a call center who just like go through a script of questions and drop down menus, yes, no, and pay for like a lot of unnecessary prescriptions.
This is a good question. Derek Douglas asks, why are we, the audience, intrigued with these stories? Theranos, Purdue Pharma, Insys. Why?
That's a good one. I think you see really the extremes of human behavior. I think that one of the things that I talked about somewhat the techniques of how I wrote it. I was always interested in like, how could these people do this who seemed like regular people? And I think that's part of the appeal of all of these stories, that like in some way we kind of like identify with them, but then in other ways it just seems like, oh my God, this is impossible. How could they have done this? And so, I was tempted to kind of understand it because I think they were human. And but I think like part of the appeal is just like, how do people go to lengths like this? How, what kind of desperation drives them there? What kind of circumstances in their life? Like people like Elizabeth Holmes, it's like a big question mark, right? Like it's a big mystery. Like what drove her? What did she think about? And that's like part of the fascination of these stories.
It's true crime, but it's a little bit of a different crime. You said, we talked about this, but the question is some of the bad guys, some of the characters in your book, you're still in touch with them. And the question is, what is it like, which you sort of spoke to, and then a specific question, are they still incarcerated?
Yeah, so many of them are. John Kapoor is in prison in Duluth, Minnesota. Some of them have been moved into, partly because of like COVID-19 and attempts to like limit the population of prisons. Nonviolent offenders have been moved into halfway house or then into house arrest. And in some cases they've been released entirely, but a lot of them are still behind bars. Yes.
I'm going to call for a final round of questions from everyone. And in the meantime, I will ask you, so you've been on book tour for all of a day, and you've done pre-interviews and you've seen reviews. People tend to see the same things and you know, comment on the same issues without too much. Well, there are always parts as the author that you feel like, oh no, look at this, or like, I would like this message to get across. Is there something that you would like to tell us, or to tell us to look out for when we all buy the book? The link is in the chat. Is there something that, that comes to mind?
So you know, it's been very nice to see people's responses to the book. I mean, one part that's like always interesting is like the different things that people take from your book, and they come away with completely different impressions. I mean, I actually find that great, that sometimes they come away with completely different opinions about the people in it. And then, you know, I think like some of the reviews have made the book sound a little more like out for blood than I think it is. Like, you know, I mean, one of the thing about doing interviews is that like often, you know, you're doing an interview for a news network, a news program. And so they're interested in the kind of newsy angle of this, of like, you know, enforcement in the opioid industry. So I think that can have the effect of making this sound like a little bit of a different book than it is. Like they think it's an issue book that might be kind of dry. And like, you know, one thing I would like to emphasize is like, ultimately, this is a story. And I think this is like how, in my thinking, you get people to care about the wider issue here, is that like, this is a drama. There's like incredible characters in this. You know, I sometimes joke with my friends. It's like, well, it's kind of a book about the opioid industry, but it's also kind of a book about like power, greed, betrayal, sex. You know, it's a little like the HBO show Succession. So you know, I was gratified by one review saying like, you can have very little background in the topic and still be completely drawn into this book.
There was a moment where you know, there's the like wrapping video, and it reminded me of Succession, and just like the thought and to cringe.
Yes.
There are two questions. We'll have to duel it out. It's too early, this person says, but have you gotten any feedback from people who work at more established pharma companies? And of course, it's always interesting to think, you know, how will this impact blowers and future law-abiding citizens, and not so much?
I haven't heard yet from people at more established companies, but I did, you know, talk to them in the course of reporting the book. You know, I mean, as I said, I think like some of the coverage probably makes the book sound like it's like a big speech about the evils of the pharmaceutical industry, which I don't really think it is. But like, so I've like seen a little bit of like blowback on, you know, social media of like, oh, well, these people were the bad apples. They don't represent everybody. Well, if you read the book, I think you'll have a more complete understanding of what it really says about that.
The final question is interesting. We've all been told that our pharmaceutical industry is the most innovative in the world. Your book suggests that at least some of the innovation is directed towards marketing drugs and not developing them. Is that a concern? And it's an interesting question to ask, as you know, most of us, or hopefully many of us, have been boosted and benefited quite a lot from some of these scientists as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is one thing I would like to say, is that like, you know, you see the incredible value of these vaccines, that like, I would never dispute like the value and necessity of the pharmaceutical industry and the kind of like incredible innovation they're capable of, and like life-saving treatments. It is the marketing piece of this that I sometimes question the value of to society. You have, I think drug companies often, they justify the high cost of the drug by saying, well, we had to put 10 years into researching this, clinical trials, et cetera. We should get some return from that. But like, Senate investigations have delved into this. It's like, it doesn't really fully hold water. This argument. A lot of that research is undertaken by government entities and not the companies themselves. And as the questioner suggests, a lot of the money goes into like these aggressive marketing tactics. How do you differentiate yourself from the competitor product? The product in many cases is kind of like Me Too, is not that different from the other one. But you've got to spend the money to make sure it's yours that the doctor writes on the prescription pad. So, there, in a way, there's really like the pharma business is like two businesses. There's drug development, the science part, and then there's the selling part. And I really think there's quite different worlds.
So we are at the end of our launch party virtually for Evan Hughes's new book, The Hard Sell. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Evan. Congratulations again. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you, Alexis, and thanks to the audience for coming.
Yes, thank you, Evan Hughes, Alexis Coe. What a wonderful discussion. I think I speak for everybody when I say I wish we had more time. Thank you everyone in the audience for joining us this evening. Your patronage is what allows us to host wonderful programming like this, and we can't continue to do it without the book sales to support them. So as a gentle reminder, I've put the book link to The Hard Sell in the chat. It'll take you to the Politics and Prose website. While you're there, after you purchase the book, I hope you'll visit the events page. We'd love to see you at an event soon. In the meantime, everybody, stay well and well read.